And so without further ado, I will begin introducing our panelists. I will mention one administrative point. This panel is going to be divided into two sections. We'll have the presentations first, a brief break, and then we'll be coming back for questions afterwards. We'll give you a chance to digest what you've heard. So first, if we can bring them up on the screen. Got it right in front of me. Miss Cleo PASKAL, who is an expert in the political side of the Pacific Islands and who is a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. As well on the screen, we have Dr. Tarcisius KABUTAULAKA, who is a professor at the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. And beside me, Ms. Darshana BARUAH, fellow with the Southeast Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Of course, if you look at the back of your program, there's a QR code. All of our panelists are extremely well known in their fields and are well written in addition. So without further ado, Ms. PASKAL.
Hello, bonjour. It's a great pleasure to be with you virtually, although I hear the food is great. I really wish I had been there in person. I was, something unavoidable happened and I couldn't get there. And I'd just like to thank the incredibly professional team putting this together. They've been great. The Navy League, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you very much for having this as a topic. It is one that's moving very quickly. And I'd just like to, my remit is to take a look at sort of how the region is viewed strategically. I do have a presentation. If it could go up, that'd be helpful. So why this is on the program probably has to do with something involving this photo. This is the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, and his new Chinese friends. When that security deal was signed not that long ago, it sent some shockwaves through those who hadn't been following the region closely. And people were sort of going, well, what happened? Well, we're going to take a little look at what happened, and we're going to start by how we think China views the region. Next slide, please. Can we get the next slide? There we go. So anybody who wants this presentation is more than welcome to have it. There are words in it, but they're mostly pictures. These words were written by Professor Jian Yang, who was a member of parliament in New Zealand. Before that, he taught for over 15 years at a spy school in China. And he wrote a book in 2011 called The Pacific Islands and China's Grand Strategy, Small States, Big Games. And in it, he wrote, China's growing involvement in the South Pacific is part of China's growing involvement worldwide. An isolated study without understanding China's grand strategy and overall foreign policy goals can be misguided. So according to Professor Yang, what were those goals? He said they were based on China's concept of comprehensive national power. That's a term that you find all over the Chinese think tanks, which was adopted in the 1990s and has constituted the foundation of China's foreign policy. This concept of comprehensive national power is an empirical metric. Bernard Moreland, who's one of the best China analysts I know, said one of the important things to understand about CNP is that it's an objective metric. Beijing constantly calculates and recalculates China's CNP relative to other nations. China's goal is to be number one in terms of comprehensive national power. So what goes into that metric? Next slide, please. We got a sense of it when she inaugurated China's National Security Commission in 2014. And he said the National Security Commission would integrate territorial security, military security, economic security, cultural security, social security, technology security, information security, ecological security, resource security, and nuclear security. This is very comprehensive. Their view of what goes into comprehensive national power does not follow the same sorts of delineations that Western analysts might use when calculating, for example, we'd say military power and economic power. They might calculate things even down to whether we've taken a panda into the zoo as a soft power metric contributor. So understanding this idea of comprehensive national power as it's expressed in the Chinese think tanks and policymaking community helps connect the dots. Why do they have an enormous embassy in a place like Tonga? Well, it's not just for the normal diplomatic things that we would associate with an embassy. There's a lot of other things going on that they see advances their comprehensive national power. Next slide, please. What tools are used to advance comprehensive national power? We got a sense of that also from Chinese researchers. This book, I hope most of you know it. If you don't, I recommend you read it. It's available for free online. Unrestricted Warfare came out in 1999. It was written by 2 PLA Air Force colonels, and it describes how they think China can legitimately conduct warfare. And it is, they weren't fired after this book came out, so that tells you something. Next slide, please. Unrestricted Warfare lists 24 different types of warfare that are considered legitimate. That includes ecological warfare, space warfare, but also sanctions warfare, media warfare, ideological warfare. So in terms of the sort of sanctions stuff that we're seeing with Russia, the PLA has been anticipating sanctions warfare openly for at least 23 years. And they're not only wanting to defend against it, they're wanting to figure out how to use it. If you want to know more about this and potentially how to counter it, there's a very good free book available online from the Marine Corps University Press, written by a former Marine, called Political Warfare Strategies for Combating China's Plan to Win Without Fighting. I highly recommend it. So we're getting a sense that they want to advance comprehensive national power. They're using unrestricted warfare. What does that mean in the real world, and especially from a naval perspective? Next slide, please. In order to be able to get China's incredibly large and quickly expanding Navy, maritime militia, etc., off the coast, they need to be able to break the island chains. And this is an image from a 2012 PLA handbook of the island chains. It's why Taiwan is so important. You need to be able to knock out Taiwan, or, I mean, you know, if you can get Japan or the Philippines, then great, but that's less likely than Taiwan, I think, from a Chinese planner perspective, so that you can get the subs out, you can overfly, and you can get out of the bathtub of the South China Sea. What does that mean from the point of view of what we're looking at now? It means that your circle defense, your power projection and your defense circle doesn't start at the Chinese coast. If you want Taiwan, it starts at Taiwan and then goes out around that, and that means the Pacific Islands. Next slide, please. So as Lieutenant Marrack mentioned, you know, some zones have more history than they deserve, and one of them is the Pacific Islands. So they're on the front lines, obviously, of many of the climate issues that we're seeing, but they've also been on the geopolitical front line for a very long time. Next slide, please. This is an image from Punch from about 120 years ago called The Tug of Peace, and the woman in the middle represents Samoa, and fighting over her are the US, UK, Germany. There's been geopolitical contest in that region since the colonial period, and just to get a sense of how intense it is and how the people of the region have lived it, and so how they know, how they're actually very geopolitically astute for obvious reasons. We're going to take a look at one location. Next slide, please. We're going to look at Rongelap Atoll in the Marshalls. For some, it may look like it's in the middle of nowhere, but when you start drawing transportation lines between China and South America, or San Francisco and Australia, you see actually there's a lot that passes through there. For about several thousand years, the people of the region were doing their own thing. It probably genetically came from the original people of Taiwan, and just got on with it. Next slide, please. Then the colonial period hit them hard, and in the 17th and 18th century, Spain came in, and then in 1885, Germany came in. Next slide, please. And then there was World War I. And after World War I, that region was handed over by the UN to the Empire of Japan as the South Sea Mandate. And Japan had ambitions that may sound a little similar. Next slide, please. The goal was to establish this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So the idea was you've got nasty colonial UK in one corner and nasty colonial US in the other corner, and they're causing all sorts of problems in the region. Next slide, please. And if everybody just lived under the Japanese flag, it would be completely peaceful and everybody would be happy except the UK and the US. Those ambitions resulted in World War II. I mean, I'm obviously reducing a lot of history here. And if we get back to Rongelap, next slide, please. This is what happened. There were Japanese installations on the atoll. They were bombed. Nearby, Kwajalein was the site of over 5,000 Japanese and Korean slave laborers died, but 177 Americans died. It was part of one of, very brutal, bloody, costly campaign to liberate the islands. After the end of World War II, next slide, please, the area was handed over by the UN. It was a trust territory of the UN. It was handed over as the only strategic area, strategic trust territory, to the United States. And this includes Palau, Marshall Islands, Tarcisius, Micronesia, Guam. For those of you who've been to Guam, if you can kind of see, there's a little dent in it. That's where Guam is. Guam is outright United States, and the area covers a part of the ocean that is as large as the continental United States. So what happened after that, World War II, if you go back to Rongelap, what happened was under the US trust territory, next slide please, there were 67 nuclear tests of Marshalls. Rongelap was not nuked, but nearby Bikini was in '54 with the Casa Bravo test. The result was the Rongelap population had to be evacuated quite urgently a couple days later. And to make a long story short, they tried to move back, then they moved out, then they tried to move back again, and now there are very few people who live there, and it's uncertain how safe or not it is. Next slide, please. Rongelap, as mentioned, is part of the Marshall Islands. It entered the Marshall Islands along with the other two US freely associated states, Palau and Micronesia, Tarcisius and Micronesia, entered into a compact of free association with the United States. This is a unique relationship. If anybody asks who the best friends of the United States are, there is no question. It is Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. They're independent countries who have trusted their defense and security through these agreements to the United States. In return, they can work in the United States, serve in the US military, they get some financial support. These agreements underpin the entire US defense posture in Asia, and it moves the front line, the US defensive front line, effectively from Hawaii off the coast of Asia. The human cost to build this relationship in blood was huge. The blood of Americans and allies is soaked into those shores, and the cost of getting it back, even if possible, if it was lost, for example, to China's political worker, otherwise would be enormous if it was possible even. Without it, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and South Korea become very hard to defend, and it's worth noting that both Palau and the Marshall Islands recognize Taiwan. That relationship, the compacts are, the financial component are up for renegotiation every 20 years. And we are in a period of renewal now, and it's not going great. This is a letter that was sent from the 3 freely associated states ambassadors to Dr. Kurt Campbell, who's the Indo-Pacific coordinator for the National Security Council in the US, in late September. And the letter says, to put it simply, the US economic assistance is insufficient. I can explain why if anybody's interested. The governments we represent cannot rely on a successful outcome from what has been presented. So just to recap, you're on Rongelap, okay? You were independent, then you were taken by Spain, then Germany, then the UN, then administered by Japan, then the UN, then administered by the US, then you're independent. But you have this unusual agreement. These people, you know, they have lived geopolitics like very few others have. And now they're getting hit by the latest phase, which is Chinese political warfare. And if you've heard of Rongelap in the news recently, it's because this lovely couple wanted to set up a Rongelap Atoll special administrative region, which would have involved relaxing immigration regulations, basically creating a country within a country. And to do that, they were buying off politicians and influential people in marshals with amounts like $7,000, $22,000. They were indicted and are currently awaiting trial in New York. They are part of, I would argue, a very effective Chinese political warfare operation. They only missed bringing down the government of the marshals by one vote, came very close to succeeding. And you can be sure it's not going to stop because they're part of a larger political warfare operation, which is part of the unrestricted warfare, which is the goal of which is to advance China's comprehensive national power, especially in the context of Taiwan. Next slide, please. And there's a very good study on that just came out from USIP that looks at in more detail. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that this is not new. There's Xi visiting Pacific Island countries in 2014. Next slide, please. And there's engagement all across Oceania with the goal of shifting countries from goodwill to support to dependency. Anybody interested can go through this list. One element of it that I'd like to highlight is that the engagement is often braided. So it has a commercial front to it. It has a strategic backing, but there's almost always some sort of criminal or corruption component to it. And from a Western perspective, that's the string to pull on. Go after the criminality, the people of the region will be very happy for it. Next slide, please. So the reason we're probably having this panel, as mentioned, is the Solomon Islands Security Cooperation Agreement. We've seen the draft of it, and we're told that the draft is very similar to what was eventually signed. In the agreement, it says that the goal, one of the options the government of the Solomons has, specifically Prime Minister Sogavari in this case, is to call in the PLA to maintain social order and to protect Chinese citizens in major projects. There was then an announced visit by Wang Yi, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, to the region, and two more documents were circulated: China Pacific Island countries' common development vision, which sounds a lot like that East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and the China Pacific Islands 5-year action plan on common development, which is to support that vision. Elements of the vision and the action plan, next slide please, are a blueprint for security colonization. It talks about police training, network governance, cyberspace, free trade area, cooperation with customs, inspection, quarantine, better policy environment, Confucius Institutes, direct disaster management, which include pre-positioning, emergency supplies, law enforcement, capacity building, cooperation, laboratory construction, fingerprint testing, forensics, everything. If you had a wish list for how to control a country, this is it. And when Wang Yi visited, and I don't think, by the way, I don't think people say, oh, it's a big failure, he didn't get the sign. I don't think this was intended to be signed. I think this was floated so they could identify who was for the deal and who wasn't, and go after those who weren't, and support those who did. And when Wang Yi went through the region, next slide, please. These are the exclusive economic zones of the countries he visited. You can see that, in fact, they've jumped over, if they get what they want, they've jumped over the first and second island chain and are in fact building their own island chain with the ability to cause Australia and New Zealand quite a lot of trouble. Next slide, please. President David Panuelo of the Federated States of Micronesia, as mentioned, people in the region know what they're looking at. And he said that this was the single most game-changing proposed agreement in the Pacific in any of our lifetimes. And he was very clear what it was about. To be clear, that's China's long-term goal, to take Taiwan peacefully if possible through war if necessary. Now, in the process of doing that, what China is accomplishing in the region is fracturing societies. Next slide, please. So the goal is to win without fighting. The tactic is unrestricted warfare, and one pathway from tactic to goal is entropic warfare, which is a process of degrading or running down or trend to disorder. They are putting in, like we saw in the Marshalls, trying to bring down governments, putting in influence operations, all that sort of stuff. And we're seeing it all over the region. Next slide, please. So in Yap, for example, this is a former governor of Yap who said that Beijing created a boxing ring in Yap, pitting leaders against leaders and citizens against citizens. And he went on and on to describe the process. It's very interesting, very helpful reading. Next slide, please. When the Solomons switched from Taiwan to China in 2019, Kiribati did as well. Next slide, please. And they're similarly having problems. Kiribati fired its judges. They were foreigners, and I think there's a case to be made that they should have had local judges. But then they appointed the Attorney General as acting Chief Justice, which brings in all sorts of questions about independence. Next slide, please. And just to show, this is where Kiribati is on the map. These are highly strategic locations. Next slide, please. What's the US doing about it? Well, there's been a flurry of activity. There was a big Pacific Islands US Leaders Summit, which Kiribati didn't show up at. There are a whole bunch of different announcements, including embassies and all that sort of stuff. And for our Canadian participants, one aspect of that was the announcement of the Partners in the Blue Pacific, which consists of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, and Canada. This is a funding mechanism. We can discuss whether it seems relevant or not afterwards. Next slide, please. And there were two new international law policies announced, which seem to have slipped under the radar. One was the freezing of baselines so that climate change won't affect exclusive economic zone claims. And the other is the United States recognizing Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign states. Niue has a population of 1,700 people and its citizens have New Zealand passports. So there were all these announcements. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. But the question is there going to be any on the ground action? And as the US is making these announcements, which are important if they do get enacted in the way that they should be, China is forging on ahead. So the National Security Coordinator, Palau, put out this report recently saying that the Chinese spy ship, the Wanwang 5, was in their waters and they couldn't do anything about it. And the US isn't helping. Meanwhile, next slide, please. If you take a look at the way the Chinese Navy has grown, next slide, please, you can see the image on the left is what it looked like in 2000, and the right is 2020. This is a slide from Captain James Fennell, former head of intelligence for the US Pacific Fleet. And what's the goal? In 2008, Admiral Keating told the Senate Armed Services Committee that a senior Chinese officer suggested to him, as we develop our aircraft carriers, why don't we reach an agreement, you and I? You take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West, we'll share information, and we'll save you the trouble of deploying your naval forces west of the Pacific. So, next slide. As Lieutenant MARRACK mentioned, you got to go back to the old maps. This is the World War II map. The red line is the extent of Japanese possessions during World War II. Right now, China is doing the island hopping campaign through political warfare that the US had to do through blood in order to get back. And unless we truly understand the goals of China in the region, we may be back in a similar position very soon. Next slide, please. Thank you, merci.
Ms. Pascal, if I could get my microphone back for 30 seconds. It's not a game by any means, but seeing what is actually going on is huge, and knowing the rules we play by and seeing the map with the continental United States laid over, I think will be valuable for our next presentation. Dr. Tarcisius KABUTAULAKA, if you are on the line.
I am indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Now mamanahamor ngana musolo tumaya sasanga sign dan nenim na tutuhuno. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It would have been nice to come to Canada, but unfortunately that's not possible. But great indeed to be here, great to participate in these discussions. I'm going to use my 15 minutes to focus on three things. And those three things are, one is to look at Oceania as a site for geopolitical competition. And then secondly, to look at the engagement with Pacific Island countries by different countries, both China as well as Western countries. And third, to spend a bit of time talking about the potential impacts of all that. Now, what we've seen in the last 10 years in particular, but perhaps much longer than that, is that the Oceania region, or places that we call Pacific Islands, have found themselves once again at the center of huge geopolitical competition. And I say once again because they were previously a site for geopolitical competition during the Cold War period, and particularly the competition between Western countries led by the US and the former Soviet Union. However, what we are seeing today is different from that period. And it's different in a number of ways. First, it's different in terms of the competing powers, or at least one of them. And secondly, it's different also because the Pacific Island countries that we know today are not the same as they were during the Cold War period. And so let me spend a bit of time looking at these different players. And let's begin with China. And I want to begin by saying that China is a different power from what we saw in the Soviet Union, and different in a number of ways. The first is that it is a global economic power much more so than the Soviet Union was. And because of that, it has footprints globally, economically. We see their footprints or their visibility in different parts of the world in terms of Chinese commodities, in terms of Chinese investments, and also in terms of Chinese diplomacy or the presence of the Chinese state in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and increasingly in the Pacific Islands as well. But China's footprint is also in terms of its people. Its people have had a long history of global interaction. In the Pacific Islands, it goes back to the 1800s. So those three things, Chinese commodity, Chinese investment, the Chinese state, and a large Chinese diaspora population globally. The second way in which China is different is, along with its economic power, we see China assert itself politically as well. So we have Chinese investors going out and the Chinese state coming out as well. And we've seen since the late 1970s, the Chinese state's growing influence globally, but also an assertive one as well. And much more recently, we've seen it in the Pacific Islands. And the third thing is the Chinese military, and Cleo has spent a bit of time talking about the Chinese military. And although the Chinese military's hardware is in nowhere close to the US, it is still a large military. And it is still also an important consideration, particularly given the increasing modernization of the Chinese military, and particularly the Chinese Navy. Earlier this year, Beijing announced that it was increasing its defense spending for 2022 by 7.1%, which will make it $229 billion Now, that's nowhere close to the US. The US defense spending is over $768 billion. That is for this year, 2022. But one thing that is important to note, though, is that as China projects itself globally in economic terms, in political terms, there is also a potential, and we've seen it with the US and other global powers as well, that in the longer term, powerful countries often project themselves militarily as well. And that's something that we've seen in history. So that's China and why it is different from the former Soviet Union. And therefore, in terms of Pacific Island countries trying to deal with China, they need to think through all these things. Now let's look at the other players, the US and its allies. The US, Australia, France, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and other Western countries are still the dominant powers in the region. This is despite China's increasing influence. And we see the dominance in a number of ways, one of which is military. The US has the largest military presence in the Pacific Islands region. It has bases in Hawaii, in Guam or Guam, in the Marshall Islands, and in Australia. In 2020, Palau invited the US under the compact to build a military presence and radar facilities in its territory. There are plans to build a military base in FSM, or the Federated States of Micronesia. And more recently, we've heard about the deployment of B-52 bombers in Australia's Northern Territory. Of course, under AUKUS, the UK and the US are helping Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And the US and Australia are upgrading Lombrum Naval Base in Manus in Papua New Guinea. So let's not be mistaken. In terms of military presence, the US and its allies have more presence in the region than China at the moment. That does not mean that in the future there is a potential for China projecting itself militarily as well, and I'll come to have a look at that. The other thing that is interesting to note about the US and its allies' relationship with the Pacific, and Cleo mentioned this earlier on, is the kinds of special arrangements that they have with some Pacific Island countries. So the Compact of Free Association agreement with Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, which has three components. One is the immigration component, which allows people from those places to come to the US and work without the need for visa. The second component is the financial component, and that allows for the US to provide financial support to those countries. Now, those two components of the Compact Agreement are currently under negotiations. Palau, FSM, and the Marshall Islands are having their negotiations with the US on that. There is a third component, though, and that is the military component, which gives the US the right to have access to those places for military purposes, even when it needs. Now, China does not have those kinds of arrangements with the Pacific Islands. The third thing about the US and its allies is arrangements with places like Aotearoa with the Cook Islands in Niue, the self-governing status that gives them a special relationship where Niueans and Cook Islanders carry New Zealand passport, and also there are close relationships, particularly when it comes to security issues. The fourth thing to note about the US and its allies is what I call entangled populations. that we see a lot of Pacific Islanders in Aotearoa, New Zealand, increasingly in Australia, and also increasingly here in the US. And so these relationships are not only state relationships, but they are also people relationships. We do not see a lot of Pacific Islanders in China because China did not have that colonial connection that the Western countries had, and also the arrangements that enable Pacific Islanders to go to Aotearoa, to Australia, or to here in the US. And so that entangled population, I think, is important to take into consideration in a lot of our discussions of geopolitics as well. I want to mention, however, that this is not the case for the entire Pacific. So if you look at the Melanesian countries, particularly Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, and to a certain extent, Vanuatu and Fiji as well, you will note that these countries do not have the kind of arrangements that the COFA countries have, or Cook Islands in Niue, and the arrangements between Samoa and New Zealand as well. And so what you see is that a lot of the Melanesian countries do not have the entangled population that I was talking about earlier on. There are not a lot of Melanesians living in other parts, in Australia or in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or here in the US. Here in Hawaii, I am one of about 10 Solomon Islanders. And so you don't have a lot of those people going out. However, at the same time, it is important to note that the economies, particularly of Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Solomon Islands, in the last couple of years, has become really entangled with China. And not only through Chinese assistance, but as a result of Chinese investments, particularly in the natural resource extractive industries. In the case of Fiji, a lot of it is in mining. So Watukola gold in Fiji, for instance, which used to be owned by Emperor, is now largely owned by a Chinese company. You have Sinfa in Vanuatu in Fiji. Even the Porgera mine, which used to be owned largely by a Canadian company, the largest shareholder is now Chinese. And then you have Goldrich in the Solomons. The bauxite mining in Renal is also Chinese. And so you have this entanglement with Melanesia economically, but you do not have the same thing with a lot of the Western countries. Now, Pacific Island countries are also different from the Cold War period. And the main way in which they're different is that during the Cold War period, a lot of the Pacific Islands were either still colonial territory or had just gained independence. Samoa in 1962, Nauru in 1968, and a lot of the countries in the 1970s, and eventually you had Palau in 1994. And so for much of the Cold War period, or at least later in the Cold War, a lot of these countries were beginning to explore their foreign policies. They were beginning to figure out how they relate to others around the world. Now, that's different now. Most of these countries have been independent for the last couple of decades. And therefore, they have had the opportunity to rethink relationships and to also look for relationships beyond just the traditional Western countries. And that includes China. Now, let's be clear that for some of these countries, the relationship with China has existed for a long time. 1975, in the case of Papua New Guinea and Fiji. And what we've seen is that a change in that relationship that has already existed, a change because of what was going on in China and China's ability to project itself much more than it had prior to the late 1970s, and also changed because Pacific Island countries find that they do have agency and are able to engage with other countries in ways that they did not have. And so you see Fiji after the 2006 coups, or the 1987, the 2000 and the 2006 coup, looking elsewhere for relationship, particularly look north, but especially towards China. So those things make the Pacific's engagement and the geopolitical competition different. China's involvement, the nature of Australia, New Zealand, and the US and its allies' involvement, and also the Pacific Islands. Now, my second point is engaging with Pacific Islands. How in this new era of hyper geopolitical competition, how do we engage with Pacific Island countries? And I think the first thing, and I mentioned that many Pacific Island countries have been independent for a while. The first thing is respecting the sovereignty and the agency of Pacific Island countries. And for a lot of these countries, that's the only commodity that they have is their sovereignty. And therefore it is a very valuable one. And so being able to recognize that and engage them in ways that demonstrate that respect, I think is really, really important. Now, in the last couple of years, we've seen particularly Western countries, but also China, and I'll comment on China a little bit, but Western countries coming up with frameworks in which they would use to engage with the Pacific Islands. We've seen things like the Blue Pacific. We've seen more recently the US Pacific Partnership Declaration. But if you look at the Pacific Islands, and I mentioned sovereignty issues, that Pacific Islands countries have identified issues that are important to them. And a lot of this could be found in the Blue Pacific of 2017. And then you have the Boyer Declaration of 2018. Cleo mentioned earlier on that for Pacific Island countries, the most important existential threat is not necessarily China, rather it's climate change. And they have been consistently clear about that that's the issue that for them is really, really important. Now, in terms of China's engagement with the Pacific Islands, what we've seen for many years is that China tended to focus on bilateral relationships. That's changing as China is engaging more and more multilaterally through frameworks such as the China-Pacific Islands Foreign Ministers meetings, and more recently its attempts to establish its economic and security pact with the Pacific. Of course, that didn't go through, largely because there was no consensus amongst Pacific Island countries to sign that pact. In terms of the US and its allies, we've seen, as I mentioned, the Blue Pacific partners to the Blue Pacific. Now, the partners to the Blue Pacific, in a way one could understand it, that it's these countries coming together to see how they coordinate their relationships and assistance to the Pacific. But the question arises, were Pacific Islanders and Pacific Island countries part of that discussion? If they were the target for that partnership, were they at all consulted or were they involved? And so it raises the question whether in such partnerships, Pacific Islands are real partners or are they simply pawns in this increasing geopolitical competition? I mentioned the declaration on the US-Pacific Partnership. Okay, and then of course, the other issue that I wanted to raise here is the issue of maritime surveillance. And that's really, really important for the Pacific, and particularly in relation not so much what China is doing in the Pacific, but more in terms of smuggling of illicit drugs and people, of illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing. Now, one of the questions that we were given was, how can places like Canada engage with the Pacific Islands? And I think this is one area that is really, really important. Yes, we've seen Chinese involvement, particularly in fisheries, but increasingly we're seeing a lot of drugs going through the Pacific for markets in Australia and New Zealand. Those are the major markets. But we are beginning to see some of those drugs creating markets within the Pacific Islands in places like Fiji, for instance, a lot of it coming from South America. Now, what are the impacts of this? And I want to focus on one thing that I want to raise as an important consideration, and that's the potential for increasing militarization in the way that we saw during the Cold War. The increasing military presence from other countries in the Pacific Islands. At the moment, it's mostly the US and its allies. But as I mentioned earlier on, there is the potential that China could also in the future project itself militarily. The other thing in relation to maritime surveillance is that to ensure that maritime surveillance does not become militarized or become a way of getting military presence into the Pacific, that it is law enforcement rather than using maritime surveillance for military purposes. And the third point I want to mention is the militarization of law enforcement institutions within the Pacific. That there is a danger that in the midst of this geopolitical competition, the donor partners could either intentionally or unintentionally militarize law enforcement. And I'll give an example. Recently, as some of you know, Australia supplied Mk18 rifles to the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force, a force that is not fully trusted by a lot of Solomon Islanders. China has also provided training for the Solomon Islands police as well. And increasingly, the question arises whether we are creating law enforcement institutions that are both appropriate and affordable for Pacific Island places. And I am concerned that there is a potential that because we focus so much on the geopolitical competition, we think that the threat internationally is the same as the threat within. And therefore we are creating police forces that are not appropriate for local context, and also that Pacific Island governments can't afford to maintain in the longer term. Now let me conclude by pointing a number of things. One is that, yes, the Pacific Islands is an arena for new geopolitical competition, and that's going to be the case for a while. Second, China is a power that is here to stay, and therefore we need to figure out how to deal with it. And third, the US and its allies, as we know, will continue to try and strengthen their control in the Pacific Islands. Now, those two things, China as a power to stay and the US and its allies strengthening, could lead to increasing militarization in the Pacific Islands. For Pacific Island countries, the renewed interest is a welcome thing, because to a certain extent, in the post-Cold War period, the Pacific Islands has, to some extent, been not as important as it was during the Cold War. And so that renewed interest, both from the West as well as from China, is welcomed by a lot of Pacific Island leaders. However, the challenge for them is managing these multiple relationships between competing powers to ensure that they benefit from it, rather than simply being used as a pawn in the geopolitical competition. Anyway, I think I've gone over my allocated 15 minutes, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. KABUTAULAKA. It's always important to know what's going on and seeing how your allies and partners are involved. And I think part of that is, this may be a game of chess, but it may also be a game of cribbage, where part of it is understanding the objectives of your partners and seeing how the board goes. We have time to go to the next one. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lieutenant, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak here today, and very delighted to join you in person. I was asked to look at role of islands in the Indo-Pacific, and most often in a conference in the Indo-Pacific, I think the Indo part of it somewhere goes missing, and naturally geography matters, and there's much more on the Pacific. I thought I would start by with a little bit on the Indian Ocean, which is core of my research, and we've developed this interactive map of the Indian Ocean region to really look at the region as whole, to break down a continental silo of a maritime domain, which foreign ministries often divided between Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, but from a maritime domain, it's very much one region from the eastern coast of Africa to the western shores of Australia. The highlighted points right now are the key choke points in the Indian Ocean region. This is an interactive map and I don't have control of it, but luckily I am talking to naval officers. I don't have to point out choke points in the Indian Ocean region. And yes, please click the island nations. So those are all of the littorals and island nations and island territories in the Indian Ocean region. And I thought, we're talking about islands, and why is it that we're talking about islands and geopolitics? Why has it come back into competition now, or why is it important now? And one of the main aspects, and I think this goes directly to naval conversations, as sea lines of communications. If we can turn on the layer for shipping lanes on the map, please. We map this based on energy, shipping, ships carrying liquid energy through the Indian Ocean region in the year 2021. So this is based on actual data. And again, you're aware of the islands where they are: Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, Comoros, but also island territories of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Reunion, Diego Garcia, and others. But essentially look at sort of the traffic in the southwest of Indian Ocean region, south of Madagascar, the Persian Gulf, and where locations from point of view, and it gives a perspective or an understanding of why islands matter, or why islands have always been important to maritime security and naval strategy. This is again on the Indian Ocean part of it, but this is true even for the Pacific. Thank you. Please. I do encourage you to go into the map and look at all of the different features of it, or sort of the islands around it. It'll give you distances, it'll give you different aspects of it. Again, I don't have control of it, so I'll try not to complicate it and stop it here. But the idea is that if we go back to why we are talking about islands again, and I think geography comes as the key part of it. From a naval point of view, from a naval strategy point of view, islands have always been important. Islands have been key bases, whether it has been during the colonial period, whether it has been during the Second World War, whether it has been through the Cold War, and even now. So from a naval strategy point of view, any development in any island, whether it's Sri Lanka or whether it is Mauritius, or whether it's the Solomon Islands or Fiji, it always concerns bigger powers in the area. Geography is key. But I suppose what has changed in terms of islands and their role in geopolitical competition is, while great powers have always had competition amongst themselves and they've competed against each other, throughout history, rarely any great power has had to consider the sovereignty of small island nations. Island nations did not have that sort of an agency. Dr. Tarcisius talked about when islands gained independence, many of them didn't gain independence all the way through the 90s. So through the Cold War, islands did not have the agency that they could exercise today in a way that they did in the last set of geopolitical competitions. Great powers are not used to being influenced by small powers. Now, if you ask, do they really have the power and the agency to influence great power competition? I would say in the 21st century, they do. A, because of their geography, and B, look at the influence of their agency. Let's take the recent example of Solomon Islands. It was important and significant enough for United States Pacific power to host the first ever Pacific Island Summit in 2022. If you are really a Pacific power and if the Pacific theater is important to you, I think it should not be in 2022 that you end up hosting the first island summit, bringing all the islands to to Washington D.C. A problem of the the agency and great power competition is a reactionary policy, because great powers have been so complacent in not recognizing or having to consider the agency islands play, that islands have that sovereign nation, and I think that's what Dr. Tarcisius was talking about. Islands have the agency to choose their own foreign policy choices, their military choices, their political choices, and their economic choices. And those choices can have a direct impact on great powers in the region, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's Australia, India, or Japan. So I think one drawback of this reactionary competition vis-a-vis islands at the center is a lot of resources and capabilities get caught up, where Solomon Islands was able to garner that sort of attention and get United States at the highest level go down to the region after a gap of 40 years. So unless this strategy is thought through from a maritime perspective or a naval strategy perspective or a great power perspective, it's going to be hard to manage this reactionary policy, where every time something happens in Fiji, every time something happens in Solomon Islands or Sri Lanka or Maldives or Madagascar, great powers across the world will be compelled to react and respond to it, and it's going to be temporary, it's going to be reactionary, and it's going to be unsustainable. Coming to the point of maritime security, I think the definition of security itself is very different. Maritime security increasingly is being divided between naval strategy and maritime security, as seen by a lot of small powers and island nations. We're sitting in a room with naval officers from different countries across the world in a conference on maritime security. How many naval officers are here from small island nations? It's because a lot of the small island nations don't even have a navy, but they are tasked with their maritime security priorities. And I think that says, that talks to the core of the different perceptions on what constitutes maritime security. So for instance, if United States is talking about maritime security with a small power, small island nation, the definition of maritime security itself is so different and distinct that there's perhaps cross wires and gap in policy where you don't even agree on what constitutes security. The defense minister of Fiji at the Shangri-La Dialogue 2022 got up on stage and has said that I have no interest in geopolitics. The biggest national security threat that my country faces and my #1 task as the defense minister is climate change. You're unlikely to hear that from the defense minister of from United States or Japan or Australia or India or anybody for that matter. So there is a difference in the concept of security itself, and maritime security has, and when countries talk about maritime security, I think that has to, both sides of maritime security has to be considered. From a naval strategy point of view, the geography of islands remain. They have become independent, they have their own agency, they have their own political choices. But from a political point of view, the agency of island nations in shaping great power competition is still poorly understood, and that is something that's going to have an impact in the great power competition in 21st century. In sort of the last concluding point that I'll say in terms of China is, again, the good thing about having really good co-panelists is that it takes off a lot of your comments and I don't have to go through everything. But on the China angle is, and Dr. Tarcisius touched on it, China is not always considered a bad player by smaller nations or even other players in the region. This map maps all the disputes in the Indian Ocean region as well. We haven't done it on the Pacific, but when you look at territorial disputes in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean region, you'll quickly realize that China doesn't have a single territorial dispute with any island nations, either in the Indian Ocean or in the South Pacific. every territorial dispute is a legacy of the colonial period. So the bad actors, if you really look at good versus bad actor, would come out to be the Western nations who are saying that we are the better democracies, we are better power, work with us. There's also no legacy of nuclear tests, that China doesn't have to work with that. There's no political baggage, and I think one thing that has stood for China is being present in the region. Again, on the Pacific, we've heard two very comprehensive presentations on embassies and etc. And let me say, on the Indian Ocean side, China is the only country with an embassy in each of the islands in the Indian Ocean region. No other country has an embassy in all the islands in the Indian Ocean region. So they have been present. While the narrative from Washington and from others might be that China is a new player that is coming in to compete with the United States, a lot of the countries on the ground will point to you and say that China has actually been there consistently from the 60s and 70s. They are not the ones who have, when Secretary Blinken went to Fiji in February of this year, I think it was the first time in 37 years that a US Secretary of State had made a visit to the region. When Prime Minister Modi went to Sri Lanka in 2015, I think it was after a gap of 28 years. So there has been gaps by your prominent security players which has been filled by China. And I don't think so everybody takes China as a problematic player. And I think it goes back to, which will be my concluding point, is the good versus bad power. We're trying to define the competition in terms of the necessary evil, US being the necessary evil, but good power, and China being the bad power. But if we approached it from the point of view of power itself, China as an ambitious maritime agenda is not doing anything different that most other maritime nations or naval powers with ambitions have sought to do. It's just that it's doing it in the post-1945 world, where we all agreed there's a certain set of rules and certain set of norms that will stand, which was decided by a particular set of nations where a lot of them were still under colonial rule. So if you approach it from the point of view of power, I think that will provide the counter perspective to how smaller nations are viewing this, where they're not saying US is bad and we want to work more with the China, or we don't see problems with China. It's essentially saying that great powers break rules and deny rules whenever it's in their interest. Only smaller nations have to do it. So it's for us as a choice, what do we gain most? How can we maximize this geopolitical competition? Because they are very aware of the limited role that they play. But again, as Dr. Tarcisius said, agency and sovereignty are the two things that they have, regardless of how small they are. It's one vote at the United Nations. It doesn't matter, they don't have a military size, their economic power cannot compete with any of the navies represented in this room. But multilateral forums and norms and rules actually work in their favor. And I think breaking down the good versus bad power and looking at it purely from a maritime power and what China seeks to do and where islands play a role, I think would give a new perspective on how perhaps we can approach and navigate some of these difficult waters. I know our panel has gone over, so I'll stop here and take more Q&A.
Thank you, Ms. BARUAH. I think we'll take a 20-minute break now, so back for 1:15, and we'll begin with the question and answer period.
Victoria, are you there? there, Sebastian?
Hi there, it's Sebastian. Room is muted. You can speak freely now.
I usually have a price on what I say, but to speak freely is a privilege. Hi. Yeah, Cleo kept you hopping, didn't she?
Ward, are you there?
You did
Yes.
very well and very appreciated.
Can you hear me, Sebastian? So Cleo, was Sebastian able to keep up with you?
Perfectly. It was excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Cleo. How's it going? I can see you there. They're
Can you hear
just
me?
starting to head back now from the coffee break. Should be back shortly.
Can you hear Edmonton?
Thanks for your
Hello?
patience, by the way, during my
I'm
slide
not sure he
advancing
can
now.
hear either of us, Cleo. Hang on.
No, 1 second. Okay, now I should be able to hear you, Ward. Sorry about that.
Right. You can hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yeah, sorry about that.
Good. I just, was this an unscheduled break that happened?
No, this was a scheduled break that they had.
Okay. We just went a little long, is that what?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My apologies. I was not let known that it was happening. I was ready to jump into Q&A as well, and it looks like they went to break. So they should be back hopefully soon.
It was a call shot, so that's fine. All right, I'll leave you be it. Everything's still recording. We
Correct.
still have the two presenters on the line for the Q&A, so all's good. So I'll get out of your hair, and folks, have a good Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you, Ward. And for those presenters that are remaining on the line, if you could turn on your cameras in about 5 minutes, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks again for all your help.
Thanks again. Yeah, appreciate it.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a quick cup of coffee and are rejuvenated for a brief question and answer period. Just before I open the floor to any questions, a reminder that we're looking for questions, not comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I got a question for Darshana. My name's Pete Levy from the Royal Australian Navy. Great expose around the Indian Ocean there. Would you be able to expand a little bit more on, as I know your background, on the on Africa itself, the east coast of Africa, and how you see that side playing out, as well as the islands of the Indian Ocean? Thanks.
Thank you. Trust someone from Perth to have an Indian Ocean question, right? I think in the whole conversation on Indo-Pacific, Africa is the missing angle, because the moment you say Africa, it's the mindset's such a continental aspect of it that you completely forget that it has an entire coast in the Indian Ocean region. China's first overseas base in the world was in Djibouti, which was the Indian Ocean coast, but it was somewhere categorized as an Africa development and wasn't probably paid that much attention to it. The African islands, which is Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, and Comoros, have more or less similar experiences to and views that we've heard from the Pacific or from India and Sri Lanka. And I also think, actually, from a competition point of view, perhaps a second Chinese base, if at all, in the Indian Ocean that comes up will be in the eastern coast of Africa, and not really in Myanmar or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, because it's very closely washed, and given one is in Djibouti and a potential in the Southwest Indian Ocean region, it still allows the Chinese military to maintain a presence there and to be able to protect, engage with the region and provide cover for the Persian Gulf between the two facilities. So I generally do think that the big missing picture or the angle of the Indo-Pacific conversation is the Africa angle, because Chinese dependency on the Indian Ocean is on crude oil energy is about 76% of their crude oil energy. And it's not just a naval dependency, it's also their political, economic, military, diplomatic, and strategic engagements, where whether it's markets, resources, oil, Africa, South Asia, Middle East, it's all through the Indian Ocean region. And I think that's the part that we are not thinking about and thinking through. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out in Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, but the Indo part of it does not end with India. It actually does go all the way to the coast of Africa. And to understand maritime developments, it'll be good to also look at that aspect. Thank you for the question.
Angus Topshe, Royal Canadian Navy. The two themes I heard from the panel seem to be that China has a lot of interest in building relationships with the islands of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And the second thing was that most of those nations see climate change as an existential threat. So I guess my question is, for whoever would like to take it on, is do they link those? Do the islands tell China that we expect you to take action on climate change, or are they simply ignoring it and focusing on the transactional nature of that relationship?
Dr. KABUTAULAKA, would you like to take that question?
Thank you. That's a really important question. I think they do. And if you follow Pacific Island leaders at any of their international engagements, they often refer to the Boer Declaration and the Blue Pacific Strategy. And at the center of that are two things. One is regionalism, the importance of ensuring that Pacific Island countries operate collectively. And at the center of that collective diplomacy is climate change issue. And I think they have made it very clear in the discussions with the US in Washington, DC in September, and they have made it clear to the Chinese as well. Whether or not in the longer term, China, given its own domestic development, will take on climate change is another issue. I think rhetorically, Beijing has been saying that, and not only to Pacific Island countries, but globally as well, that it is willing to engage with climate change issues. Whether that translates to anything, we are yet to see. We recently, as you know, we have the COP27 meeting in Egypt, and so it'll be interesting to see the documents coming out of that in terms of China's commitments.
I'll just add to it that on the climate change conversation, it's not always sea level rise. There's also an infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. If there's a conversation on infrastructure or ports, whether that conversation is, framed around, say, resilient infrastructure or the funding required for them to build that infrastructure, I think from island point of view, that's the strategy and that's the conversation, and may not directly be addressing climate change, but I think that conversation is somewhere seeped in. But you're right that in terms of climate change, in terms of respecting islands, I think China is as much at fault as anyone else at this point, especially on climate financing.
And if I may add to that, so a lot of the discussion, particularly coming from Western country, tends to focus on mitigation, on climate change mitigation, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, which is important. For a lot of Pacific Island countries, the focus is often on adaptation. And so if infrastructure development would assist in adaptation, then that's important to the island countries.
Thank you, Dr. KABUTAULAKA. Do we have another question?
Alexandre Chalon-Duplay, I have a question on China's quest for minerals and rare earth, and especially China reserve two areas for deep seabed exploration. And I would like to know what are the connections of this Chinese quest with its relation with the neighboring nations. So there is one segment which is in the Pacific, not far from South America, and the other one in the Indian Ocean, not far from Madagascar.
Ms. PASKAL, do you have any comments about the Chinese mineral extraction program?
Sure, this is the Clarion-Clipperton Zone question. China is very adept at using international organizations to advance its strategic and economic goals. And it has had countries for example, Tonga, back its request to be able to explore in Clarion in that zone. We've also seen it make requests in zones that may not have that many minerals, but are highly strategically located off, for example, off of the southeast coast of Africa, which is a useful place to be able to put research vessels that may have other capabilities as well including if you're concerned about submarine traffic, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's just one other example of China maximizing international organization, the rules of international organizations when it suits it, and ignoring them when they don't. And in that context, I'd like to just quickly give, since different points of view are always helpful for figuring out things, I'd like to give some different points of view on some of the things that were brought up. So for example, this issue of China having no territorial disputes, I think that obviously the countries around China and the South China Sea would think differently. And China, of course, completely ignored the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea Tribute Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling on the Philippines. I'd also this issue of the U.S. and allies militarizing the zone. This isn't, the U.S. was very happy to pull out after the Cold War. This is in fact a complaint from many of the Pacific Islands. But it was once China started talking about things like Guam killer missiles that you started to see this reaction happening. And the idea of China being here to stay, China, of course, is here to stay. The Chinese Communist Party, not so sure. In fact, I would hope it isn't, but it's going to be a rough road ahead regardless. In terms of the diaspora of the Chinese people throughout the region, yes, of course, but the people aren't the state. And it's very important to understand that the Chinese people are sometimes the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party, and you shouldn't be equating the people and the state. It's kind of a very dangerous thing. In terms of hardware, it's very difficult to do the defense budget to defense budget equation because of civil military fusion doctrines within China, and because the budget is very opaque and power purchase parity is different. And a lot of the Chinese hardware looks a lot like the US hardware. For example, anybody who's seen the C-17 and the Y-20. In terms of the compacts of free association, yes, they give the US access into the zone, but they're only one election away at any time for abrogation. They should not be assumed to be a permanent part of US defense structure in the region. In terms of comparative strengths, this is the last one between China and the US. Personally, I think it's more important to look at comparative goals. What happens to the people of the region if one wins versus the other? If the US and allies, freedom of navigation, transparency, rule of law, of course there are problems, can have influence in the region versus the Chinese Communist Party having influence in the region, those are two very different outcomes. So I think the outcomes need to be incorporated into the analysis. What China has in mind for the region is very, very different. And lastly, in terms of agency, it is very important for the Pacific Islands to have agency, and there are certain areas which they can't. So for example, Prime Minister Sogavare canceled the Pacific, or said he had a choice between the Pacific Games and holding an election in 2023, and he chose the Pacific Games, and he's postponed the elections. This is a perfect opportunity for the people of the Pacific, the countries of the Pacific, through the Pacific Island Forum to say, we're not going to go to those Pacific Games. If you're saying games are more important than democracy, we don't want to be a part of it. So there are, everybody needs to, I think, step up, including the countries of the Pacific, because the dangers to the people of the region. And remember, the leadership, Sogavare, Prime Minister Sogavare might like the Chinese, but there are people in the Solomons who are literally willing to die rather than take Chinese money and allow Chinese into the region. And that would be including in the province of Malaita. Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. PASKAL. I think we have another.
Thanks very much. Greg Poling with CSIS in DC, not CSIS here. So 2 questions, if I may. Darshana, would you be able to speak a little bit to Diego Garcia, its role in the Indian Ocean, and the difficult position it puts the US and the UK and India all in? And the second, for any of the speakers, what's the role of France here, both in the Indian Ocean with Réunion, but also with the French territories in the Pacific, where it's noticeable that the French are not part of the partners in the Blue Pacific, despite there being a whole lot more French citizens in the Pacific than, for instance, UK citizens, much less Canadian or German citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. You've heard me enough to know that it's hard for me to not bring up Diego Garcia in a presentation, and I really tried. So thank you for bringing it up. So I think the example that I used to say in terms of the international rules, norms, and UNCLOS was that the Philippines 2016 PCA ruling, right? That China did not abide by the PCA ruling, and United Nations, the tribunal, the ICJ has essentially ruled twice in favor of Mauritius, saying that United Kingdom and United States illegally occupies Diego Garcia, and both countries have refused to abide by that ruling. So from a small island point of view, again, it comes down to it's not just China not abiding by rules, it's just great powers don't do it what's in their interest. But the good news is, as of I think a week and a half ago, UK has agreed to renegotiate sovereignty of Chagos archipelago, the entire archipelago, which was detached during independence of Mauritius. And I think it's a great precedence to say that rules and norms matter. And if you're going to go around waving the flag of rules-based international order, we're going to have to adhere by it, but it's going to have a lot of implications on it, what these negotiations are going to mean. Sovereignty negotiations are never easy, but Mauritius has said we don't expect US to vacate the base in Diego Garcia. If from a US point of view, because Djibouti and Bahrain and everything else comes sort of either in AFRICOM or CENTCOM, the only Indian Ocean base they have is Diego Garcia. So take that away, and it's a massive gap in between, and leaving Diego Garcia empty would also be problematic for Delhi. I don't think so. Delhi would actually be happy about it. But the question was never about the relevance of the base or the importance of the base. The base is very important for strategic relevance, naval strategy. It's equidistant from Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. But it was a question of norms and rules, and I think it's good that finally UK and US are willing to negotiate on that. On France, it's a very interesting question. On amongst I think all the P5s, amongst the P5s right now, France is the only country, despite having territorial disputes, they haven't been dragged to a court at the UN. Everyone else has been dragged in some case or the other. And France has territories in both Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Actually, in the Indian Ocean, for India, France is one of the key major players. They have very strategic territories on both sides of it. But I think France has managed to navigate their difficult conversations with countries a little differently in managing exclusive economic zones where they've been able to stay away from it. But again, when you go to Africa, it's a completely different conversation. Comoros will tell you that French are thieves and they took Mayotte away from us. So there's this different perspective to it. But France is a very important player, and it is actually a missed opportunity from Washington's point of view, that Washington does not engage France as much in the Indian Ocean region because of the Euro-Atlantic vision and because of categorizing France in continental Europe and the Atlantic aspect of it. Again, on the Pacific side of it, France is not part of PBB yet. They are observers, I think, at this point in time, but they have territories there. They're very present. There's also a Pacific Quad. We hear about the other one in India, Australia, US, and Japan, but Pacific Quad has been functioning for over a decade on issues of illegal fishing and other areas. So I think France is a very important player and is one that perhaps US and its allies can work more on. As it understands the region well, it has territories and enough assets to be able to be present in the area.
I'll just ask Ms. PASKAL, Dr. KABUTAULAKA, do either of you have any comments on France in the Indo or Pacific regions?
I think in the case of the Pacific Islands, France is an important player, and exactly because it has territories in the region, but also because these territories are now members of the Pacific Islands Forum. And I know questions have been raised about whether it's a representation of New Caledonia and French Polynesia, or through them also a representation of France. And so France's involvement in the region is particularly important. I want to come back to a point that Cleo raised earlier on about the extension of the parliament in the Solomon Islands. And I think it is one thing to say that we should have the rule of democracy, but at the same time respect the processes of parliament. That went through parliament. And whether one disagrees with the outcome of the parliament meeting is one thing, but the decision to extend the life of parliament to until after the Pacific Games was a parliamentary decision. Now, personally, I completely disagree with it, but I respect the fact that it went through that process. On the issue of US military presence in the region, if you read the Compact of Free Association, it states very clearly that the military component is in perpetuity unless it is both parties decide that it should be discontinued. And also US military presence, despite US withdrawing from the region in terms of its assistance and its diplomatic commitments, closing down embassies in various Pacific Island places, its military presence in the region continued to exist even in the post-Second World War period. We've seen the potential for increasing military presence in Guam, where currently the US owns about 30% of land area. And of course, here in Hawaii, the Indo-PACOM has control over the biggest US military presence anywhere in any region in the world. And of course, they continue to use Kwajalein for various purposes. And so I think while the post-Second World War period has to a certain extent seen a decline in US engagement, it did not necessarily see a decline in US military presence.
Thank you.
Can I, a few things?
Of course.
This is great. This is great for the conference that we get to actually dig into a few things a little bit deeper. Yes, it was a parliamentary process that postponed the elections, but we have the documents that show that 39 out of the 50 MPs were given money from a Chinese slush fund about a year beforehand, and a lot of those seem to overlap with those who voted for postponing the election. In terms of France, France is, and in terms of the compact, there was a change in the negotiations about 20 years ago when the US specifically linked the money from the trust funds to continued military and security access into the freely associated states. That was, I would argue, a mistake. It directly linked the money to the access. And so that creates a situation where they can say, okay, we don't want your money and you won't get any access. And we know that in all cases, China has literally blank checks waiting to outbid the US for at least walking away, if not access. And what's the US going to do? Send in the Marines again? It's just not, it's not viable. These are independent countries that do have agency, and they are not, the US made a mistake 20 years ago. In terms of France, France is on the UN decolonization list for French Polynesia, so we all get to be members of international oversight. From a specifically Canadian perspective, what's relevant is the people of French Polynesia, New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna are French citizens. Now that means that they can come and study in Quebec for graduate courses at the same rates as Quebec citizens. So this is a point of potential entry and relationship building that is unique to Canada and could potentially be worked on for better relationships within the Pacific. Canada, because of its bilingual status, can work with all parts of the Pacific and doesn't have the sort of baggage that we've heard about with some of the other partners. The French are very complicated members of the Indo-Pacific community, and part of it has to do with weapons sales. So they have forged their own path through the region and are very good at it and have been there for a long time. You know, as was mentioned, the relationship with India goes back decades, especially in space in the Indian Ocean area. And so it does not benefit them to dilute their distinct bilateral relationships, access and leverage by going into too many multilateral organizations where that gets, they have to carry other people's baggage and their access gets diluted. Thank you.
It's an interesting point for Canadians about having members of the Indo-Pacific community who are French citizens coming to Quebec, because creating those links is part of what this is all about. And as Dr. KABUTAULAKA has mentioned, it's creating that consensus among partners or allies. I think we'll have one more question.
Kia ora, I'm Fiona from New Zealand. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how women, gender, peace and security fits in, and where that sits in terms of priorities for the Pacific, from a Pacific Island nations perspective.
We can start with you and then go to PASKAL.
Was that specifically for the Pacific where it fits in? Woman, peace and gender, right? Yeah. I think that's, again, it's a great great question, and it's something that has been I think, part of a lot of Indo-Pacific strategies and a lot of Indo-Pacific conversation, especially in the military, also in terms of providing, whether it's in India, whether it's across the Indo-Pacific. But I think it's a question. I'll leave the Pacific conversation to my co-panelists, but I think it's still a very nascent conversation. It's very limited presence in terms of whether you see it in policy spaces, whether you see it in military, whether you see it in others, but it has become certainly a conversation. I think Australia has a dominant sort of aspect to it in its foreign policy, but I don't have a strong answer or a positive answer at this point where I could say that it is something that a lot of countries are committed to, or that has translated beyond a lot of initiatives and announcements outside of DEI initiatives that you hear a lot in terms of advancing foreign policy engagements. But I hope that leaders like yourself would also push it within institutions and organizations, and in help translate a lot of the political ideas and initiatives into practical spaces, and as will I. Thank you for the question.
Ms. PASKAL?
Yeah, very cool. So the women of the Pacific are some of the most incredible leaders in the region. And when the Solomons switched to China, one of their first goals was to establish a presence in Tulagi, which people who know their World War II history will know well. And it was the women of Tulagi who blocked that from happening. And it was the women's groups in Solomons who protested most clearly, in some cases, about the security deal with China. And some of the women journalists in the Solomons are some of the most eloquent about the issues facing the region. So I think there's an incredible strength and talent and embedded knowledge in the women of the Pacific, and I hope that we get to hear from more of them. Thank you.
Kia ora. I'm not the most qualified person to comment on this, but let me say that what we've seen is that there is a lot of the discussions around politics tend to be very masculine, and I think there is a need to go beyond that and see, the importance of gender in these discussions. And just adding on to what Cleo was saying, if we go back in history a little bit, some of you will probably remember that in the 1970s, not Vanuatu, but Palau attempted to introduce an anti-nuclear constitution. And the people who were at the foundation of that were the women of Palau. And part of the reason for that is that Palau is a matrilineal society. But it's also because women found it useful to be part of these discussions, not only about Palau's relationship with the US, but Palau's relationship with growing power or powerful countries in the 1970s. I think that gender, and in particular, women play a lot of important role in this geopolitical discussion. We have the Prime Minister of Samoa, of course, and we have other women leaders like yourself and others around the region. But again, this is not just a women's responsibility. This is everybody's responsibility, and making it central to the discussion is important.
Thank you. I think that wraps up this question and answer period. And I'd like everyone for coming and listening to this panel today.